Hi, Misha here, and recently, because of the new Hobbymaster 172 scale diecast models, we looked at the Dassault Rafale, France's current 4+ generation fighter, if you will. And because I was thinking of that, let's talk about kind of an interesting in-between. The Mirage 3 is very well known, but the Mirage F1 and the Mirage 2000 kind of get caught up in the middle, but both are important. And today let's talk about the 2000. And whereas in the first video I had a couple of different Hobbymaster models and one from Panzerkampf, now I have two from Panzerkampf and one from Hobbymaster. All three in 172 scale diecast, and kind of representing the major variants or types. Over here we have the Mirage 2000B. Here we have the updated Mirage 2005F, the successor to the 2000C. And over here we have perhaps the most important version, the Mirage 2000D. Very, very similar to the 2000N. Probably the most successful, at least within France. So let's just dive in. We'll begin with putting the 2000B on the stand. And you know, in the first video I mentioned the Panzerkampf are fine for the Rafales, but the Hobbymasters are clearly better. Well, when it comes to the Mirage 2000s, Hobbymasters are still probably objectively better. However, the Panzerkampf 2000 is better than the Rafale that they do. It feels more solid. It is almost entirely die-cast metal, and it shows. Plus, Hobbymaster has never done the two-seat variant, at least not that I can think of. If so, it was a long time ago. And it's actually very important. And this fighter was never really planned for. The idea in the beginning, in the 1960s, was a joint project with the English, the UK. They had then the Supercot Jaguar, and the next effort was a swing wing fighter. But much as the Eurofighter fell apart with France, this fell apart too, and the UK would end up going with West Germany, and that would be the Tornado, Panavia, leaving France alone to do its thing. But it needed to replace the older Mirage 3, and the F1 itself would need a successor. And of course that would be originally the G8. That was France's swing wing, variable geometry wing aircraft. They would do a fixed wing version, the G8A, and they would eventually do the Super G8A. Good enough aircraft, except it was very expensive, time-consuming to produce. And then a little-known fighter called the F-16 appears on the scene, and its multi-function capabilities, multi-role abilities, attractive price point, ease of maintenance and operations meant that a lot of nations started wanting to buy it. Therefore, some other projects that had kind of been cooking on the back burner at Dassault were brought forward. There was the Delta 1000, that didn't go anywhere. Then we had the Delta 2000. In 1975, that became the Mirage 2000. The French government, seeing that their next fighter might take a while, committed to buy 200. And so Dassault would kind of put their eggs in that basket going forward. And it wouldn't take long. 1976, specifications would be drawn up. And already by 1977, the first prototypes ready to go. And just over 2 years, the first prototype would fly. The second prototype would fly in 1978. And the third prototype would fly in 1979, and it was important because it was the first to have weapons systems, so weapons testing ability. Now, those are the only 3 prototypes that the government ordered. But Dassault, wanting a demonstrator and test aircraft of their own, built a 4th prototype, and that was the first 2-seater. And it would fly in 1980. The first production model would be ready by 1982. The single seat would be known as the Mirage 2000C. C is basically hunter. It's French speak for fighter. And the 2-seater would be a combat-capable trainer, adopted as the Mirage 2000B. And it was essentially the same dimensions and same capability. To make room for the 2nd seat, they eliminated the cannon and a little bit of fuel tankage, but otherwise it had the same capabilities. And these officially enter into French Air Force service in 1984, and the first squadron would be equipped and readied that year. Ultimately, they would purchase 124 single-seat planes and 30 twin-seaters. So yeah, what is our aircraft here? How is it different from the Mirage 3? As you can see, it's a delta wing design like the 3. The F1 kind of went to more of a conventional layout, so they're returning to the famous delta, but thanks to advancements in technology, maneuverability was improved and low speed performance was improved, kind of making up for some of the shortcomings of the Mirage 3. When they were designing the G8, they were thinking more of a interdictor aircraft, and turns out because of 1970s fighter combat was changing, air supremacy was becoming more important. Dogfighters were coming back in, like the F-14 or the MiG-23. So they changed roles. Instead of being an interdictor, long-range striker first, ground attack abilities were secondary, air-to-air was primary. And it shows in the early generations of the Mirage 2000. This aircraft is about 47 feet long, has a nearly 30-foot wingspan. At altitude, it's capable of exceeding Mach 2, up to maybe 2.2, but at low altitude sea level, it's not quite supersonic. Max altitude on it, about 56,000 feet. You can make it about 1,000 miles without fuel tanks. Double that if you add a couple of external tanks. And had a total of 9 hard points, 2 under each wing, 5 under the fuselage. And originally it carried the Magic missile as well as the Super 530. The versions that had cannons, they had 2 30mm cannon with 125 rounds each. So yeah, not bad, 150 rounds of cannon. And in the beginning, it really had very limited ground attack, ground strike abilities. It could carry rocket pods. It could carry dumb bombs like the Mark 82, their NATO standards. But really, it was an air-to-air, especially the early ons. The engine it used, the Smegma M53, is actually a leftover from earlier projects like the G8A and Super G8, but it was actually a good engine for this. It was lightweight, relatively simple, relatively cost-effective, relatively reliable, and relatively easy to work on. This made it an excellent competitor to the F-16. This wasn't meant to be a huge technological step forward. It was meant to be a reasonable, lightweight, reasonably small competitor to aircraft like that, because they were still working on what would eventually become the Rafale, but it ended up taking a lot longer than they thought. So this is always meant to be the interim solution. And that's not a bad thing. So these would be in French service. The original 2000 would be used in the first Gulf War in 1991. Because it had no ground strike capabilities of note, it mostly flew escort and patrol missions. But it was clear that an upgrade would be needed. Now, there have been some foreign customers. Egypt was actually the first to place an order, but India would be the first to receive theirs. India would get their planes in 1985, Egypt in 1986. You would see some other interested nations like Brazil. No one would buy it in massive numbers. Most users would have between 40 and 60. Some, like Brazil, as few as a dozen. Typically, they would buy mostly single-seaters, but a couple of twin-seaters for conversion training. It's very much an interim measure. India thought about buying 150, which would have probably led to licensed production in country, but since the order was cut back, it didn't happen. And then really the whole reason India wanted it was because Pakistan acquired F-16s, so yeah, directly going up against it. But yeah, by 1989, this was an aging design. Its limitations were known, and Dassault announced an improved version, basically a midlife update of the Mirage 2000. Thus, the 2000-5 was born. This would appear 1990, 1991 for the first prototypes. In fact, the first prototype was a converted 2000B, converted to the new -5 standard. And the first production model would fly in 1991. And actually the first customer was Taiwan, because of recent new acquisitions with mainland China, communist China, who had kind of had their own troubles in the 60s and 70s. They were getting back on track by the late 80s and 90s. Taiwan felt that they needed an edge, so they would purchase the 2000-5. In 1993, the French Air Force, partially because the Rafale was taking longer than intended, partially to help Dassault out economically, agreed to have 37 of their existing 2000Cs updated to the new standard. And from there you would have other customers as well. India would end up upgrading their fleet. But what is it? Well, externally, not much has changed. Most of it's under the hood. So this is the model from the French Air Force from Hobbymaster. The engine was already updated into production of the 2000C. The big update here would be the avionics, especially the cockpit. It would get new displays, multifunction, and then the radar, which kind of relates to the weapon systems. A new radar was put in. It could track, well, it could identify up to 24 targets now. It could track up to 8, and it could launch missiles at 4 different targets and track them at the same time. This was a vast improvement over the original. And each time they improved it, it was always look down, shoot down, but it became better and better, lower detection towards the ground, so on and so forth. But really where it shone was the multi-function ability. It could actually do air to ground and air to surface for sea. It did have to use an external targeting pod when in the attack role, but still it had capabilities of doing that. It could also use the new Mika missile, which was beyond visual range. Could still use the older Magics and Super 530s, but better abilities, just more sophisticated, and just overall better. There would also be the 2000-5 Mark II, sometimes also written as 2000-9, a second wave of updates around the year 2000, which had a further improved cockpit, true glass cockpit, an onboard oxygen generator, further updates to the radar system, further access to newer targeting designator, even recon pods. Again, just kind of rebuilding it from the inside, giving it more capabilities, and of course refurbishing existing aircraft that might be showing some stress and whatnot from years of use. This one here from Hobbymaster is still pretty much in the air-to-air configuration. And it's pretty well fully loaded up. In theory, this could carry about 13,000 pounds, but in reality, about 8,500 pounds, 9,000 is the maximum practical payload for this guy. But it is really letting the aircraft modernize, which is good, because, yeah, at this time, mid-90s, still no Rafale. So the French would get theirs, and Taiwan would receive theirs. Greece, who had purchased the original 2000, not only purchased new Dash 5 variants, they also upgraded some of their existing 2000Cs. They would end up operating a relatively large fleet of about 3 dozen, all told. And it was a good success for Dassault. Finally, 2001, 2002, the Rafale was ready. So they would continue building and refurbishing the Mirage 2000 for a bit longer. But once they completed the last Greek contract, they would shut the production line down November 2007. That's not bad, though. That's a 30-year production run. And they would build 601 aircraft. Now, that's just kind of talking about the, air-to-air interceptor light ground attack versions. And I haven't mentioned much in the way of combat. Mostly just flying patrols, doing things. Now, India would use theirs against Pakistani F-16s and others, so it's not completely without use. But really the reason I wanted to do this video is to talk about the Mirage 2000N / Mirage 2000D, the coolest variant, and the one still in service today and tomorrow. So, France is a nuclear power. Has been for a long time. So it needs a nuclear strike aircraft. In the 70s it was using the Mirage 4, but that was getting dated. And so in 1983, right as the initial 2000 was coming online, the French Air Force requested a new nuclear strike aircraft, and so they got to work making the 2000N. The first prototype, of course, was a modified 2000B, whereas the B was mostly for conversion training. The second seater would become a weapons / radar operator, and test flying would begin in 1986, and the 2000N nuclear deterrent version, nuclear strike version, would be put into service in 1988, and the production run would last until 1993. They would build 74 total, and none were exported. In fact, the French government did not clear the 2000N because of its nuclear abilities for export. And this might at first look like a 2000B, but it's really not. Also, I have it on a Hobby Master stand. I actually do have a spare Panzerkampf stand, but I wanted to put it on something that wouldn't tie up the center line, which we'll get to. This is actually a 2000D, but bear with me. In the event of nuclear war, the 2000N was supposed to come in fast and low, hugging the ground, and deliver a tactical nuclear weapon. To that end, the airframe was reinforced, not only to carry the nuclear weapon itself, but also to take the stresses of low-level flight. In addition, it had a terrain-following radar and other updated equipment for, well, terrain following. The rear cockpit, of course, would get more displays, more monitors to do all that. Essentially, dimensionally, it's about the same. It's a little bit longer, and almost 48 feet, same wingspan, same top speed. The second seat is with the B, removes the cannon, and also takes up some fuel. But because it was a strike aircraft and it needed range, they actually developed a new 2,000-liter external tank, drop tank. This has both of them on it. That would give it a range of over 2,000 miles, plus aerial refueling. You know, the French like their bolt-on fixed refueling probes. And you can easily tell the 2000N tank because it's kind of a, I don't know, tadpole look. It's got a bulb on the end. It's really fat on the end and then tapers. It's kind of a unique looking tube. It still has the 9 hard points underneath. And pretty well standard. These would usually carry Magic missiles for defense and nuclear weapons. Now there would actually be 2 batches. There would be the 2000N K1, which is the initial variant. It could not launch guided nuclear weapons, so it actually carried 2 freefall nuclear bombs, but it was just an interim measure until the radar guidance systems were ready. Then there would be the NK2, which is the primary production variant. It could carry 1 targeted nuclear weapon. It also had conventional strike capabilities as well. Somewhat limited compared to later versions, but better than the 2000C. And it also had improved self-defense. It had chaff dispensers, let everybody get jamming systems, radar warning systems, that kind of thing. Basically, the K1 was not a pre-production, but yeah, the capabilities were certainly expanded for the second production batch there. And these would definitely see service. Just because, you know, the N was meant for nuclear weapons doesn't mean they didn't deploy these. But they kind of had an idea they had a good thing on their hands. And around the same time they were working out the 2000-5 program, the 2000D came about. This variant was started in 1988 when a conventional strike aircraft, attack aircraft, was conceived. And the first prototype would be rebuilt from the 2000N prototype. Kind of reusing the same airframe, but why not? In the year 1990, they decided to call this the 2000D. D is basically the French word for multi-role. And by 1991, the first prototype would fly, begin testing. And 92, the first production model was on the line. 93, it flew, went for testing. And in 1995, this would go into French Air Force service. And the production run for the 2000D would last through 2001. And the French would purchase 86. So all told, 161 N/D variants compared with 120 some odd C variants, meaning that technically it's the most numerous version in French Air Force service. And the D is very similar to the N, except it's for conventional payload. The rear seat received more displays. The cockpit was basically what we think of as partial glass cockpit. A new technology. It had further improved defensive systems. It had further ability to mount newer weapons, including laser guided. It did accept a targeting pod, which is on this model. And since it was later than the N in production, yeah, it just has several little updates and tweaks to the design improvements. For example, the cockpit was NVG compatible night vision, because the idea behind this was it was to be an all-weather day-night strike aircraft to work alongside the Ciprocot Jaguar, which was still in French service in the 1990s. And it would see quite a bit. Essentially, you would mount your heavy ordnance on the center line or inner wing hardpoints, and then you would still carry air-to-air defensive missiles on the outboard and under the engines there. You could also carry lighter air-to-ground attack munitions on the fore or under engine points if you needed to. This would eventually be upgraded to the point that it could carry the Mica missile, as well as the Magic. And it too would have a couple of production runs. The initial DR1 wasn't fully capable. The DR2 would have full features, including use of pods and improved cockpit. And then there would actually be a DR3 standard that seems to have appeared around 2000, 2001, about the same time the 2000-9 or 2005 Mark II came around, with further improved cockpit and weapons carriage abilities. You get the idea. Improvements, because these stayed in service. There would be another round in 2009, and more recently, there would be a midlife upgrade called the DRMV. 55 of the remaining lower hour 2000Ds were selected for upgrade, which is happening right now. The upgrades are supposed to be completed by 2024, next year, meaning that the 2000D could remain in service up to the year 2030. As for the 2000N, it was kept in service for quite a long time, but that fleet was retired in 2018, and since they were never cleared for export, they basically had to be dismantled. A handful were kept by the Air Force for testing, evaluation. A couple were given to museums, but the rest were stripped down for parts and scrapped. But the 2000D is still going strong. In fact, it's a really good thing that France had these because of how long the Rafale took. And the two aircraft have worked alongside each other a number of times. That's why I wanted a model of the 2000D. I went back and forth because Panzerkampf does make the N as well, but this one's just more historically important. And, well, it's certainly not General Gaddafi's favorite aircraft. Let me explain. By the mid-90s, France's ground attack was a little lacking. It's really good the 2000 N and D came along when they did. The Jaguar was getting to the end of its service life. The Rafale was long in coming. How many times can we say that? But it really does do. And the 2000C, even the upcoming 2005, just really wouldn't have the ability to strike. So when it came time for UN NATO operations over former Yugoslavia, the N and D were called upon. In August of 1995, a 2000 N was shot down with a shoulder-fired anti-air weapon, and this really reinforced the need for better low-level defense, early warning capabilities, which would ultimately lead to the series of updates we see throughout the entire fleet in the late 90s, early 2000s. Which was good for them because after the quote-unquote War on Terror began in 2001, France was one of the first nations to send planes and be active in Afghanistan, and right at the tip of the spear for them was the 2000D. It was delivering laser-guided munitions like the GBU-12. Basically, you had 500 up to 1,000-pound bombs. It was using targeting pods. And it would continue to operate in Afghanistan from different locations in different times, all the way up until the Rafale was finally available in 2007. But the Rafale's really early voyages into combat would be monitored, and they'd be taken on and off station. They didn't have a lot of aircraft, so once the new Spiffy fighters were pulled back, the 2000s were back at it, be it the 5F or the D. They would operate out of Kandahar, especially later on, 2008, 2009, still very much be active in Afghanistan for years to come, providing close support when possible, trying to operate as close to the front lines as they could to serve Allied soldiers. It really did deliver a wide range of weapons. And then Libya happened. The Mirage 2000D was really one of the very most important and critical aircraft in the enforcement of the no-fly zone over Libya. In fact, these were among the first aircraft, along with the Rafale, to deliver ordnance in March of 2011. In their first mission, they struck a convoy, and they would continue to see a lot of flight hours throughout 2011, flying alongside the Rafale and the older F-1C, typically the R, the reconnaissance variant, was still going. And of course, the Dash 5 was still there, more or less providing air support and protection. And they began the conflict there, and they would essentially end it on October 20th. A convoy was trying to break through, and so Rafales and Mirage 2000Ds were scrambled, and they would use 500-pound bombs to stop the convoy, which would lead to the capture of Gaddafi and obviously his ultimate death. So you gotta give it credit for that. He was not a good man. And that kind of ended there. The next tour of duty of note would come in West Africa at the beginning of 2013. 6 of these, along with some older F-1CRs, would be sent to Mali to hit terrorist or rebel targets. They would operate there, which actually would show a need for kind of hot and dry performance. In 2014, flying out of Jordan initially, these would start hitting targets in Iraq. And September 2015, France would expand its operations to hit extremist terrorist targets, recruiting and weapons training centers, whatever, in Syria. And that's actually where this particular model comes from. Taking it off the stand, this is from a mission in 2016 where 4 2000Ds and 4 Rafales struck terrorist targets in Syria using the really new Scalp cruise missile. The Rafale was able to carry 2 each per plane. The 2000D was limited to 1 because the wings simply couldn't do it, so it had to be on the center line. And when I did this, I wanted to have the model with the missile underneath, because if you plug it into the stand, it takes up the 2 points. To Panzerkampf's credit, the stand actually doesn't plug in one location. It actually has 2 slots it plugs into, which gives it a good solid fit. But I really wanted my missile on here. You can also see I've got 4 air-to-air missiles for defense, and then the 2 big tanks, and then the targeting pod up front. So it's pretty well fully loaded out. It has 1 point that's not occupied. But yeah, it just continues to show them operating right alongside the Rafale. Not saying it's better than, it's certainly not, but it's that nice little brother. Kind of like the F-1C was before. And they would continue to operate in various areas. In 2018, the 2000-5 Mark II would appear, operating with coalition forces, so they're still out there. And they've been fully updated to take all the ordnance they can as well. I just really think this is a neat look. What do you think? Big old missile. So yeah, they continue to see service today. The updated 2000 DRMV first had a couple of test planes sent out in 2021 for some real-world testing and trials, and with the success there, especially seeing how they operated in Africa, that's when the program was put into full gear. So we should see over 50 updated versions. And what's kind of neat about this, a lot of the technology developed for the Rafale has also been compatible with the Mirage 2000, be it the D or the Dash 5F. So it's good to have commonality in the fleet. Yes, this does need an external targeting pod, but to be fair, so does the Rafale. So, yeah, take it as you will. The Hobbymaster one didn't come with a pod, but I assume it's because they have it more in an air-to-air configuration. Be it as it may. So what do you think of the Panzerkampf? I think this is one of their better ones. It does have opening and closing canopy. It doesn't come with pilot figures. I put Hobbymaster ones in. But the ordnance actually plugs in really nicely to the Panzerkampf. I will say the landing gear doors can be a little fidgety. Sometimes they're too tight, sometimes they're too loose. When I first got this one, the front door I installed, and then just a few minutes later, after I'd walked through the house a couple of times, it was gone. I figured it was lost forever. Tiny little part. But no, I really got lucky and I found it. So then the blue tack came out. I don't know. I've had that a lot of problems with French aircraft. They have very tiny little doors for their wheels. My Mirage F1C is bad about that too. But yeah, I think I think it's neat whenever someone does a lesser known plane. Now, lots of people do F-16s, F-15s, MiG-29s, Su-27s. But I think it's neat when a company will take a chance on a lesser known plane, because the Mirage 2000 is important. Over 315 served with the French Air Force, including the original 2000C, the updated 2000-5F, 2000N, 2000D, and the 2000B trainer. And it served 8 other nations. Again, none of them had huge fleets, but a lot of them have been in service for a very long time. Greece is still flying their 2000-5 Mark IIs. And like I said, Taiwan called upon it. And it's just a good solid aircraft, and it obviously has the ability to be refurbished and upgraded, because we've seen several generations, talked about several now, and it has seen a lot of real world combat, and it did so quite economically. It's not perfect, of course. It had limited weapons carriage ability from the get-go. Even now, it's not the best in the world at that. Its range isn't the greatest. Internal fuel capacity is not that great. But it's a relatively small aircraft, so what do you expect? But, yeah, it's kind of fun doing a outside one. I have been wanting to really revisit American aircraft. Maybe soon, but that's a lot of effort. It's a lot easier to get 3 models off the shelf than, 10. I was thinking about doing the Century series. Either that or American naval jets. Kind of have a hankering to talk about the F-8 and F-9 again. And of course the F-14, because why wouldn't I? But for now, I wanted to do this. I haven't really done many aircraft videos for you lately. I'm trying to make up for it. There's been a few new models to talk about. And more importantly, I've just kind of had the urge to do it. Things come in ebbs and flows for me. We'll get back to sci-fi stuff and whatnot pretty soon, or maybe even do tanks again. Kind of been itching to talk about Japanese tanks, but for now, it's French and apparently Soviet and Russian aircraft. That's what I've mostly been doing, but it's just kind of what I've been in the mood for. So let me know what you think. What's your favorite French plane? Mirage 3? 2000? The Rafale? Maybe you're kind of a hipster and want to go with the F1. I don't know, but let me know in the comments. With that, this is Misha. I'll catch you very soon next time.